Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about movement and how we can incorporate movement work within someone's training and sort of the reasons why you would want to do that. Before we started recording, we were just having a conversation around, how can we get CrossFit athletes and how can we get our clients to sort of start exploring different patterns of movement and doing different things, and how sometimes it can be quite difficult to build buy-in on that because it doesn't necessarily have a direct effect on kilos on the barbell, times off of your rowing intervals and performance in that sense. But it will have a positive effect on certain things like longevity and letting yourself be in the sport for longer and progress for longer, which can be difficult as an athlete to sort of zoom out and have a look at why those rotational med ball throws that you see, say, for example, baseball players doing, and you're wondering why you need to do that when all you need to focus on is getting better at thrusters and pull-ups. It can be quite difficult to take that perspective and understand the importance there. But I suppose as coaches, we've got to figure out sometimes ways of sneaking it in, and sometimes just giving the athlete. One of the things I have started to do recently is look at how training arms, doing bicep curls and tricep extensions from different angles and in different positions can actually have a real positive effect on shoulder health, and how the usual sort of shoulder health exercises of, smashing out hundreds of scapular retraction exercises and stuff like that, sometimes that actually doesn't have as the positive effect that we want it to. So I suppose what we'll start off with is, guys, how do you incorporate some of those more esoteric movement quality or developing, weird and crazy movements for your CrossFit athletes? How do you get that into their training? What are the types of things that you think are really valuable for CrossFitters to do, which might not necessarily be something that they're doing at the moment?
Well, Luke, I'm still not convinced that it matters. Why does it matter? I just need to go back and forth, right? I just need to squat straight up and down, row on my little slide, kettlebell swing, dumbbell snatch. Like, why would I care?
I suppose I can talk from a personal experience. If say, for example, you're doing the same patterns quite often, I suppose sometimes that can put you into certain postures and end up getting you to bias certain postures, which can limit your ability to share load on the system, and the system being your body. So quite often you'll end up seeing people with overuse injuries. And, for me personally, I've been working a lot on trying to bring my ribs down, trying to get myself into a little bit more of a neutral rib and pelvis relationship at resting, so that I can essentially share load on the body a little bit better and take, you could say, less of a beating when it comes to the shoulders and the hips. So that's one of the things that I've been personally working on, and I've started to work on with a lot of my clients to do, because just doing the same thing and becoming really sort of functionally adapted to do that same thing, it could lead to you actually just not being able to do much else if you wanted to explore different things. But you are putting yourself in a position where you run the risk of sort of overuse injuries and just sort of not being able to go about your training in the way that you want to, and sort of make those consistent progress, because you're sort of stalled from a tendinopathy or a tendonitis cropping up in your shoulders or in your hips or whatever it be.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's tricky about this stuff is that people do develop adaptation to their sport that is potentially beneficial, right? That if you look at Like an obvious example is some sort of elite power lifter who's like very rigid and stiff, and part of that is probably just like the way that they are, and that enables them to succeed at their sport. And part of it is adaptation to the sport, where it's like, yeah, just putting that much weight on your back consistently, like, will just like make you rigid in response to that stimulus. And that's actually good, right? That you wouldn't want to be someone attempting to, take over 1,000 pounds out of a squat rack and be like not a stiff person. Like, oh, that's potentially dangerous, right? So, figuring out what is an appropriate adaptation to the sport and what is potentially like maladaptive and is going to cause a problem in the future, I think is pretty tricky. And if we look at CrossFit, the sort of like we've been saying and like joking about a little bit is that it is very just like up and down, forward and back. And yeah, maybe at the CrossFit Games you see some additional stuff. They try to get the rotational piece in with like some sledgehammer things, and those events always end up like going sort of badly, where there's always like some sort of like unexpected twist that athletes are able to figure out that sort of like ruins the event. But it's not necessarily super clear that getting out of the sagittal plane, right, getting out of that just like straight forward and back movement is beneficial, especially when you look at the field and you see people who are generally like very overextended, Luke, like you said, ribs flared, are not necessarily great at rotational athletic movements. It's like, well, yeah, that's not necessarily what's tested. So I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate to be like, yeah, I mean, I personally think it's probably a good idea to sometimes get out of that sagittal plane for a few different reasons, but it's not necessarily clear to me that that's like a thing that we should be working on.
Yeah, I suppose if you look at it from that aspect of, okay, hey, this is what is required of you in the sport. I will make the argument that like now running as a part of the sport from that sort of quarterfinals point and onwards, and potentially maybe even the open. But like if you do look at CrossFitters run and the way that they run, it looks like they're just like a body and just like legs and arms that are just all, the torso is just completely stiff and if
it's just locked, just locked way up there, sort of, and these little tiny limbs just flailing on the side.
You're looking like SpongeBob SquarePants doing shot runs up and down the gym, right? Like that. But like, for example, like working in a transverse plane or doing some other types of movements, you can start to like then get this sort of natural alternation that exists through movements that are, like running, for example. And also, like, I mean, if you do look at, say, I'm trying to think, if you look at like some of the twisty single arm dumbbell overhead squats and that type of stuff, what you want to be doing is you don't necessarily, you just want to be able, you want to have people being able to get like overcome those challenges and those movements that are a little bit more odd as well coming into the mix. You want that to be an easier process, and giving someone more movement options is going to do that. If you are stuck in the same pattern, you're most likely going to have a difficult time when you are challenged by those other things, and you're probably going to experience some form of well, you're probably not. I don't want to start to sort of give people that like fear of injury and all this type of thing. But there you do run the potential risk of developing some overuse injuries, and those are extremely common in CrossFit, just due to the nature of the sport. The nature of the sport is, oh, you can do this much. Okay, well, now we're going to try and do more, and we're going to try and do it faster. And because of that, you need to be able to set yourself up in your training in a way that allows for longevity, it allows you to sort of keep going through stuff and going through your training. Even if it looks like it's a couple of breathing exercises at the beginning of the session and doing some med wall throws with your core work at the end or something like that. But that going through that process doesn't have to be like, okay, I'm going to devote half an hour to my training now. It can be looking at where this integrates into something else. I suppose another part of it as well if you are looking at the longevity of someone, if you want to get someone as good as possible, as quick as possible, then yeah, like this stuff goes out the window. But if you want to try to develop someone over the long term, then you need to look to try to include this at a basic level. And quite often now as well, you get people who they want to do other stuff as well. Maybe they don't necessarily, if they have moved, they still want to throw down and do CrossFit, but maybe they want to go and play some football, or maybe they want to go and try some jiu-jitsu or something else. And these are sort of other elements that you can sort of start to integrate within their training. And I know I'm very much talking about like some of the experiences I've had with my personal experiences and experiences with clients. But yeah, I think one of the things I was trying to get out earlier as well was a lot of the time when people think about improving their movement or improving their positions in CrossFit or whatever it is, it's like they're going through this real, this partner assisted stretch, which means that they're literally just their shoulders are going to get torn out of their sockets or something like that, when there's probably some low hanging fruit which hasn't been addressed. And it could be just about increasing the amount of variability within their training and not getting them to do the same thing that makes them stiff in that same pattern all the time.
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? That the yeah, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, I think kind of what you're saying there, Luke, in terms of that working through the transverse plane, I think ultimately that's just a more functional plane of movement, in the sense that you take people outside of the gym and you take people to other sports. And outside of CrossFit, most sports require a lot of work through the transverse plane. And it's a lot more varied in that sense. You take like jiu-jitsu or football, and it's like, yeah, your kind of movement through space. I don't mean like space. I mean like the space around you. That like your movement through there is
Final frontier.
Very varied. And
yeah.
you're required to move in like a, I don't know a good way to say it, spherical pattern. In the, okay.
John, well, here's the thing. You're talking about functional movement, but you're missing the definition of functional. What is the definition of functional, John?
Yeah, let's not get into that. I think
I'll tell you. If you're not going to tell us and the listeners, it's the ability to move large loads long distances quickly, John. And the best plane with which to move large loads long distances quickly is the sagittal
straight
plane.
Line, baby.
Therefore, the sagittal plane is more functional than the transverse plane, QED. What say you?
Yes. Anyway, we'll ignore that. But if once you take people outside of the CrossFit space, if you watch like people at the games and you see those kind of random events where they're doing like you say, the sled hit with a sledgehammer, or throwing sandbags over hay bales, or stuff that is not what we'd classify as typical CrossFit, you can tell the people that train outside of what is traditional CrossFit a lot more. Their movement patterns are better. They function better with like random stuff. And they sorry, just watching Todd trying to avoid a sneeze is hilarious. And when they're doing them, they look more athletic. And maybe it's they come from a background of sports where that's required. Maybe they just train it a lot more in the gym. But there's always a big disconnect between people that have only ever really done CrossFit as a sport and train traditional CrossFit methodology, compared to those that either come from other sports or have a much more varied training.
Yeah, like if you, to sort of, because I'm trying to think, like if you look at some of the old videos of, I think it was like the day in the training of number 1 and number 2, right? When phoning, I think it was like 2010. And there was one where it was like, he was just playing sport. I forget what sport it was. I think it was like, is it flag football? Is that your version of touch rugby? But he was doing that, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I would say like Froning is probably, one of these sort of more athletic and adaptable individuals involved within the sport. You can see that sort of like in sort of like the way he moves. But you don't necessarily need to have like bits of training to sort of work on this type of stuff. You can actually just go and play some sport, and I think that is actually probably a better training tool per se than getting someone to do a bunch of like 3D movement and that type of stuff. So I think it's also like it's just really difficult, isn't it, with someone who sees the things that they need to improve, which is the gymnastic skills, their lifts or whatever it is, and then it's like, okay, well, hey, do these throws or do this, this weird like ab movement, or start rolling around on the floor doing some, arm bars and all this other thing, like kettlebell arm bar, not jujitsu or anything, but doing that type of stuff, people just don't really sort of see that value because there's not like that direct link to it. So like Todd, I know that you put a lot of this movement skill work and that type of thing into recovery circuits or around the world circuits or what have you, as a way of doing that. And that's an idea that I've stolen from you, and then I get people to, but trying to think, like another example could be, now we've seen the sort of single unders and the crossover single unders programmed at the games, and trying to get someone to do like 100 single unders, and I'm like, vary up how you do it. Do reverse single unders, do single leg, do alternating single leg, or that type of thing. Seeing people and they can't even do single unders. I think there's a video actually of games athletes struggling to do single unders at, I think, one of Hinshaw's aerobic capacity things, which is ridiculous. It's like that. And if people that can't see sort of like the translation of those like lower level skills and those lower level movements and sort of how that has a knock on effect to other things involved in the sport, I think like that's something that needs to be sort of educated. And I suppose one of the things I'm starting to like look at and explore now is sort of, okay, someone is finding it difficult to with their like hinge pattern or something like that. It's like, okay, well, can they touch their toes and just do a like a toe touch and get like a nice rounding at their spine? Not actually trying to keep their back straight or something like that, but like, can they do that? Can they shift their weight back onto their heels as they do that, or are they like on their toes constantly? And those types of things, which are a lot more sort of, you could see them as like very simple movements, stuff that you would do in like PE, which is like, okay, touch the floor, touch the sky, swing your legs, go side to side, or whatever it is, that type of stuff. Like I think sometimes we go into our training as sort of CrossFitters, and it's like, well, if there's no load or a band or some like weird balance to this or some way of making it excruciatingly difficult for the average person, then I'm not going to do it. When we actually lose some of those things, which those sort of those movements that we don't want to be losing. For example, like a squat. Most people have like, especially within CrossFit, it's like, okay, can you squat with your feet together? Can you squat with the feet wide? Can you do it with your toes straight? Can you do it with your toes turned out? Like that sort of variability within movement. The best athletes will be able to do that. But what you're finding now is that you're finding people who are super stuck into, no, this is the way I do it, and that's it. And then they're like, well, I've got a bad hip, so now I need to do these clamshells before every day before I squat, or I get a bad shoulder, so every time I do butterfly pull-ups, I need to be cranking on these external rotations. It's like, there's probably something going on there that you actually need to address, and you don't actually need to be doing all of those things because like people should be able to do those things without having to hit all of this like prerequisite prehab type stuff.
Yeah, I'm going to actually say something that I do believe now, as opposed to just whatever, engaging in sophistry as I was before, right? But Luke, I think that you started to touch on this earlier, and I think this is related to what you were saying, is that with a lot of this stuff, for CrossFit athletes, we're talking about getting out of just like the forward and back, up and down movement planes, potentially using corrective exercise, potentially using sport or play as a way to engage in just like different movement patterns. The way that I look at it, which I think is pretty influenced by PRI, the Postural Restoration Institute, is you just want optionality in your movement, right? You're not necessarily going to have perfect movement. You're not necessarily going to avoid compensation. You're certainly not going to avoid asymmetry. But what you do want the ability to do is change your strategy, right? You don't want to have to use this like high tension, overextended, like purely sagittal strategy for everything that you're doing. You want the ability to get out of that as necessary. So for example, John, you're talking about just athletes looking terrible at the CrossFit Games when they're forced to do something that's more quote unquote athletic, which is like a funny thing that happens, right? And Luke, I think the SpongeBob SquarePants analogy was apt, where you're just looking at these big square torsos with little tiny limbs that can't rotate at all, attempting to do something that looks athletic, and there's like this stadium full of people, and they're like, "Ooh, that doesn't look so good," right? And that, like that's kind of funny and maybe not great for the sport. But I think that the reality is that these people don't have an alternative strategy. And so they've adapted to their sport, which is all forward and back and up and down, which is good. And they probably have some of that tendency to begin with, which is maybe why they've been successful. But the lack of optionality in their strategy impacts their performance, both when they have to do athletic events. And then, I think on the margins, there is some increased risk for bad outcomes, right? There is some increased risk for certain types of injuries, et cetera. And I think that's a little fuzzier and harder to prove and difficult to make like a clear-cut case like, oh, okay, yeah, we did this test, and then this percentage of people who failed this test are going to get tendonitis on their left elbow and tendonitis in their right knee just because they can't rotate properly. Like I'm skeptical of that kind of claim a little bit, but I do think it's reasonable and it's plausible to assume that if you don't have an alternative movement strategy and you only have this one high tension overextended strategy that you use for everything, that can put you in a bad position in a lot of different ways. So that is why I like the circuits that involve some of this more corrective exercisey rotational stuff. And then Luke and John, I want to get your feedback on this. I agree with you what you're saying, that play and sport is a really good way to work on that stuff, but that's not necessarily something that people want to do, and it's not necessarily something that people have a background in doing, nor is it something that they necessarily have the time to do. So I don't know. Do you promote that with athletes? How do you do it?
Make them juggle in their warm up or something. No, I suppose. Yeah, like any opportunity that people ever say, oh yeah, I'd like to do this or whatever it is, I'm like, yeah, great, crack on, go for it. I don't think coaches really should try to stop people from doing something for the sake of performance. I think it's important that you sort of get out and explore those things. But yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, I suppose like for example, I'm trying to think one, making like med ball throw circuits or something like that. And throwing in a core exercise every other exercise, or something along those lines. I know that's very, very tactical, but like this is something I've like drawn on. So it could be like you're doing hollow holds, and then you're doing some lateral throws, and then you're doing some V-ups, and then you're doing some other variation of it, or doing something like that, giving it a bit of a different spin, or putting it into people's warm-ups. One thing I've started to do recently is actually like give people 30-minute warm-up circuits to do, where I'm like, okay, well, these are like 3 things you'd really need to work on. I want you to get on a bike, get on a row, build up a bit of a sweat, and then, minute 1, 2, whatever, jump off, do this drill, jump back on. And I suppose like trying to thread in something that people think is a cool thing, getting a sweat on, working on their abs, doing some arms or getting a pump on, or, that type of stuff. Integrating it like that into someone's training can be very helpful. and I think that people don't necessarily pay too much attention to it because there's like you could say there's like an overarching thing that they might be actually distracted by, you could say. But yeah, it's challenging. I mean, a lot of it comes down to sort of education as well, and how that is sort of put across. Trying to find say good YouTube videos which actually explain the benefit to doing like a breathing exercise or something like that. Like I found one recently that actually like helped me because I'd like send that to people and then actually, okay, I'll do the breathing exercise now, and that's something which I think is important. But yeah, I think just trying to throw it in where they might be distracted by something that's a little bit more fun or a bit more enticing for them to do is sort of how I've started to do it.
I think one thing as well is to caution people on just jumping into other sports. The nature of people that do CrossFit is that they're kind of majority are more competitively minded. And to jump into playing football or jiu-jitsu, just to use the two examples we had earlier, like generally people who do CrossFit will try and go too hard in those. And that's the equivalent of someone coming from like being a college athlete and just jumping into a CrossFit class and thinking, oh, I can do all of this. And then they hurt themselves or they get wrecked in the first day because they don't understand the demands of it. And I think for someone trying to play other sports, unless they've specifically done training stimulus that suits the demands of that sport, they do need to be like, okay, I'm a beginner here. I need to take a step or two back. I don't need to be, twisting a knee or an ankle day one because I don't understand what I'm doing with my body in this sport. So I think there is a lot of benefit to playing other sports, but you need to understand that, yeah, I'm a beginner here. I'm not athletic in this sport, and I need to take the necessary kind of build up and ramp up to get to a point where I can push myself hard. And honestly, I think that applies to almost every sport that you've never played before. Whether it's a team sport or a individual sport, I think it's important to be realistic with your capabilities.
Yeah, John, that's a good point, because I mean the injury rate is just so much higher for like any sort of field sport than it is for like any kind of weight training based sport.
Yeah, I think that
Luke, you were going to say something.
I think it's important, obviously, I think it obviously depends a lot on the people you're working with. I know if someone was like very competitive and really wanted to push for a certain competition or peak for a certain point, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go and start and throw myself into this new sport. It's like, yeah, that really does probably need, hey, like, let's circle back. I really like this idea, but, right now might not be the best time. But I would I don't know. And I'm not going to push back on that. I do think that that's difficult to do because I don't think many people do that. I don't think many people go into, oh, I'm going to for example, when I started playing rugby again, like a couple of years back, I didn't go into it. I mean, obviously I did, thinking like, oh yeah, I'm going to take it easy or whatever it is. But like, as soon as you start playing, especially in a sort of team sport environment, sometimes that can be like really difficult. So I suppose it's sort of like you want people to have some realistic expectations about what they're capable of doing and how they should go about it. But it is really difficult because I don't think many people do that. Especially I think there's also an element of ego attached to CrossFit and the things that you do in the gym, because there is a lot. It is quite far removed from what like the average person is capable of. All of the skills and everything like that. And then people jump back into a sport which maybe they played in their youth or something. And it's just weird when you look at a bunch of people who look more out of shape than you, and they're actually just like being able to go through the sport a lot easier, and you know, they're able to change direction, and they haven't sort of lost because they had constant touches on these sort of like little skills. So that can be really difficult, because then it's like, okay, well, the one thing I do know how to do is really push hard, and then they push really hard, and then all of a sudden they just come out injured. I might be just talking about my own personal experience, but I also have maybe a couple of clients who've done something similar as well.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
reckless Luke at it again.
for me, I do program relatively high amount of kind of like prehab type stuff, and whether that's rotational or anti-rotational work, or kind of, you know, shoulder health work. Almost every day, people that I work with are going to do something in that range. So I like a lot of kind of suitcase carries, sandbag work, single arm kind of hold movement stuff, because it does just, I think it creates a more well-rounded athlete, whether it's someone who's trying to be a competitive CrossFit athlete or whether it's someone just trying to improve their health and fitness. I just think it translates well into in and out of the gym health.
But I would say that that's not prehab. That's just intelligent programming. That's this idea that Todd was saying earlier, with like the giving people more options. You're giving people, you're making people train different options through doing those things, if that makes sense. Because I think sometimes, like,
yeah, I mean, when I say prehab, I kind of mean like the things that people get from physical therapists after an injury.
Yeah.
Are the kind of drills that I would also be throwing in when someone doesn't have an injury, just in terms of strengthening and stuff. So it's not, that's just the term I use for it. It's not necessarily, yeah, I'm in intelligent programming. Great. I'm intelligent. Thanks. Perfect.
Yeah, no, I know that like prehab has like.
Don't take it back now. Don't take it back now. I'm intelligent. You said it. It's fine. Let's move on.
You call it what you want, John. I just know that, like, generally there's the sort of prehab, like, is like I'm doing this to stop myself from getting injured, as opposed to like taking a little bit more of a macro view of like, you do all this shit for CrossFit and it's all the same stuff, so let's just make you do some other stuff that's gonna make things nice and well-rounded and give the intelligent programming that John provides. Anyway.
Intelligent programmer, I think you meant to say, but that's fine.
Brilliant, as the lads say. I do think that the idea of this, like, quote unquote prehab stuff that you guys are bickering about, it serves all the purposes that you mentioned, John and Luke, but also I think that it's another way to add volume for people's training, which I think we've talked about before, especially for competitors, where it's like, okay, you're doing whatever 150 chest to bar pull-ups in this training session and 150 wall balls and rowing 300 calories, and you have 300 double unders tomorrow. Like, just like the super high volume training that people are doing, and they want to do more, and they maybe should be doing more, but just being like, okay, cool, like, you're actually doing 150 chest to bar pull-ups today and tomorrow. Like, that's maybe not the right move, but you can add more stuff to their training by using these sort of non-standard CrossFit. So I think that's another another use case for it.
I mean, do you do that to like appease their desire for more volume, or to actually like develop their capacity in a very sort of like low level way?
Yeah, I think the latter, right? Where it's like, okay, yes, maybe you want to do more, maybe you want to do double sessions, all that kind of stuff, which I think is potentially valuable for someone who is like, I'm close to qualifying for semifinals and I want to, like, what should I do? Well, like, probably more volume so you can handle it. But like I said, just doing more chest to bar pull-ups maybe isn't the right way to add volume, but being like, okay, cool, let's add some single arm pulling movements. Let's do some, John, like you mentioned, like suitcase carries, single arm hang from pull-up bar. Like, we can add more stuff that's going to be pulling style volume that is maybe not as demanding and isn't going to just be like, yeah, like do another AMRAP of chest to bar pull-ups, but does potentially get some of the same stimulus, some of the volume tolerance that they need, and then also has this ancillary benefit of hopefully making them a more resilient athlete with more movement strategies. So I like it for that reason too.
I will say, if you want to test someone outside of like a comfortable realm within CrossFit, just make them do lunges with a sandbag on one shoulder, and the next day they'll know if they do enough kind of rotational work or stuff. Like, wrecks the obliques. It's a lot of fun.
It's an awful. Yeah, awful.
Have you tried squats on one shoulder? It's funny, just like because they end up
with a sandbag.
They end up actually starting to do rotational movement. You're like, this is in your Metcon, and that's integration. That's how you integrate CrossFit workouts with all of this, rotational stuff. You don't need to do med ball throws. Just make people do twisty squats with a sandbag on one shoulder.
Yeah,
it's manipulative, Luke. Manipulative and messed up. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.